Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. That's my name. Right, it's time to resume my journey through the Spider-Verse, the live-action Spider-Verse, Sony's Spider-Man films, Marvel Spider-Man films. I'm a bit sad because I've now had to bid a fond farewell to Tobey Maguire and his iteration of Spider-Man courtesy of Sam Raimi. And if you looked at my reviews of those three films that have gone up in the last fortnight, you'll find that I've really enjoyed those films. Even Spider-Man 3, the much maligned Spider-Man 3, I thought was great fun. And the three films together are a really nice trilogy, by accident or design, that wraps up lots of story arcs, but tells the developing story of Peter Parker, Tobey Maguire becoming Spider-Man, his relationship with MJ, his relationship with Aunt May, Harry Osborn. It was really nice and intricate and worked well together. And again, as I said, watching them across 3 weeks was like having three comic magazines to read, one after the other, which is always, as I said before, the problem I have with superhero films. It's great, you watch Iron Man, fantastic, and then you've got 3 years until the next Iron Man film. Whereas with the comic books, you've got a month to wait. Certainly my recollection of when I used to read comics back in the 70s, you had to wait a week or a month for the next episode. Things are slightly different now, of course, because the films take a long time to make, but they're spectacles. However, beyond all that, Tobey Maguire, bye-bye, although we do see him a bit later on. It's time for a new Spider-Man and a new creative vision for the old webhead in the form of The Amazing Spider-Man, starring Andrew Garfield, directed by, appropriately enough, Mark Webb. This film came out in 2012. This came about because plans for a fourth, fifth and sixth Tobey Maguire trilogy collapsed, unfortunately, for various reasons. And Sony decided instead to reboot Spider-Man as The Amazing Spider-Man, which was the original title of the comic book, of course. I got this on Blu-ray. I discovered last week that I didn't have The Amazing Spider-Man 2 at all in any format. I know that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 isn't especially good, and I'm not expecting to change that view of it, but I needed to get hold of it. I hied myself over to Amazon and ordered a copy at $4.99, and then I thought, well, what if it's available cheaper on eBay? And picked it up for £2.55 on Blu-ray, including postage and packaging. I think that's probably enough for this particular film. So I don't know if it's a resealed used copy or a factory sealed original, but only cost me a couple of quid. Right, I can't put it off any longer. I suppose it's time to reacquaint myself with Andrew Garfield as The Amazing Spider-Man. So, The Amazing Spider-Man, probably not a great deal I can say about this film, really. I think it's probably not a bad film in itself and not a bad interpretation of Spider-Man. Problem is, I suppose for me, having just watched the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire films, which I enjoyed so much and seemed like such a perfect iteration of Spider-Man for the early 21st century, this just seemed unnecessary in a way. It is a shame that the plans for more Raimi Spider-Man films didn't come to fruition, because when those plans fell apart, Sony decided instead to reboot the whole franchise with a new creative team, new cast, and a whole new introduction to Spider-Man. And it just seems a bit underpowered. It seems a bit soulless, I think, because there was so much passion poured into the Raimi Spider-Man films. This just seems like, we better do another Spider-Man film, and let's just do this. It doesn't seem as if there's any love for the character and the myths and the history of the character. We see this particularly in the very first sequence, which takes us back to Peter Parker as a young boy who is hurriedly deposited to his Aunt May and Uncle Ben when his parents, who are some mysterious agents, have to disappear into the night. In the original Spider-Man comics, I don't think we ever get much reference to Peter's parents. I don't know if there was some reference to them being killed in a car crash or an accident or something. But here we have this mystery of who his parents are and what they're doing and why they have to abandon Peter. And that's not something that permeates the film. It's not a theme in the film, which again is a problem, because I think in the Sam Raimi films you did have a lot of stuff that became themes into the film. Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and these things sort of mattered. Here it's just, oh, Peter's parents are mysterious, but it don't matter, we're not going to see him again. So then we're introduced to young Peter Parker, played by Andrew Garfield, who's a student, and the dynamic is much the same. He's sort of laughed at and not taken seriously by the students, particularly Flash Thompson, who tries to intimidate him. Flash in this is more of an unpleasant bully than he has been before. Not that Flash was a major part of the Raimi trilogy, but in the originals he was a bit more playful perhaps, but here he just seems angry and vicious and very violent. Peter, though, is played by Andrew Garfield. Now, Andrew Garfield, the difference between him and Tobey Maguire. Tobey Maguire looked sort of geeky. He looked like this outsider figure. Although he wasn't unattractive, he wasn't gormless, perhaps, in the way that Peter Parker was in the original Steve Ditko illustrations. But Andrew Garfield is more of a heartthrob. He's more conventionally good looking. He has the look of a handsome young man. And it's harder to imagine him as somebody who is an outsider, somebody who's pilloried by his contemporaries and doesn't have friends. I mean, he does have this friendship with Gwen Stacy, played here by Emma Stone. But it doesn't have the resonance of the relationship with Mary Jane, Kirsten Dunst, in the Raimi films. Here they have a sort of an attraction anyway. They become sort of boyfriend, girlfriend quite quickly, and he reveals his identity later on in the film. But that's all a bit later on, because we have a good 45 minutes in this film before there's any sign of anything happening to Peter Parker, before he gets bitten by the spider in a science experiment, which again is slightly different here, because it is something to do with the experiment of Dr. Kurt Connors, played by Rhys Ifans, who becomes later on in the film the Lizard. You may remember Kurt Connors appeared in the Raimi trilogy, at least two of them, played by Dylan Baker. He was the sort of one-armed science professor, and I think even then that was setting up the potential for him to become the Lizard if the Raimi films had continued. But that's never brought to fruition in those films. Here it is. He's played by Rhys Ifans, the Welsh actor, in an uncharacteristic American accent, playing the scientist who's lost his arm in an accident. He's got a connection with Peter's parents, which brings them into contact with one another. Eventually, there's a science experiment, spiders evolve, blah, blah, blah. Peter Parker gets spider powers. There's some quite nice scenes where he discovers he's got these powers. He's got incredible athleticism. He's got a power which wasn't very much exploited in the Raimi films, where things stuck to him. He can't, things stick to his feet and stick to his hands, his palms. There's quite a good fight scene on a New York Metro Underground train before he actually becomes Spider-Man. And then it follows, broadly speaking, the path of the Raimi films. That Uncle Ben dies in an accident that Peter could have prevented. Then he becomes Spider-Man, and meanwhile Dr. Connors is doing this experiment on genetics to grow back his arm. There is actually some sort of scientific basis in his experiments, because I think a lot of it is reference to dementia and Alzheimer's, and there are certain scientific principles there which actually reflect some of the work that is being done to combat Alzheimer's. But here it's used for Dr. Connors to regenerate his missing arm. That has the unfortunate side effect, because it has genetic characteristics of lizards, and he becomes the Lizard. Not the Lizard that we see in the comics, unfortunately. He hasn't got that sort of alligator snouty look. He's basically a green man covered in scales, and it doesn't quite have the same effect. We do have later on in the film a scene where he's wearing a lab coat, as the Lizard often did in the comic strips, but he doesn't look like the sort of almost dinosaur-y lizard that we had in the comic strip. So he's very much a lizard man. And there's a few fights between them. There's quite a nice scene done in the sewer system in the water, where they're fighting in water. And eventually, because Dr. Connors, as the Lizard, has this plan to turn everybody in the city into lizard creatures, although he earlier on signposts the fact that there is a cure to this. So I think when you sort of think, well, hang on, that's a Chekhov's gun if ever there was one. And it all ends up in a battle between the Lizard and Spider-Man. Gwen Stacy's father, who is the chief of police, Captain Stacy, played by comedian Dennis Leary, he dies, and he tells Peter as Spider-Man he doesn't want his daughter Gwen put at risk by being in a relationship and trying to keep them apart. And at the end of the film, sort of reflective of the end of the first film, where there's a funeral of Norman Osborn. Peter doesn't attend the funeral of Captain Stacy and says he can't see Gwen anymore. And the film sort of fizzles out at that point. You can probably tell by the way I'm describing it that it didn't really touch me. I watched it and my attention did drift in places, I must admit. It didn't bring me in the way the Raimi films did, and I could really see the difference in style. Even though the first of the Raimi films came out 10 years earlier, the original Spider-Man film looks fresher and more imaginative, visually better, more exciting than this. This just seems like a Spider-Man film for the sake of it. You know, we have to do another Spider-Man film because the others were really successful, but we can't get the same people in. Because of that, it doesn't fly, it doesn't connect emotionally, and the action scenes aren't as good. The scenes of Spider-Man wheeling and spinning through the rooftops are fine, but maybe it's because it's the fourth Spider-Man film and the novelty's wearing off. But I think largely it is the fact that it isn't the same creatives involved. It isn't the same Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield is perfectly fine. He's a good actor. And he's a good Spider-Man, potentially. And if he'd been the first Spider-Man, although I have those misgivings about him being too good-looking, I think he would have been a good Spider-Man from the outset, although perhaps maybe a bit too young at that point. But he wasn't. He was the second Spider-Man, and he's in the shadow of a giant, really, in the form of Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, who is so good in those first three films. But this Peter is just too cool and hip and sassy. And again, we don't get, and that is one of the faults of the original Spider-Man films. I think you don't get the quippiness of Spider-Man that you got in the comics. You get it occasionally, but Spider-Man is constantly quipping, and we don't really get that much here. It just, there's no life to it. I just felt it was very, very plodding and very disappointing, and it was not as good as I remember. I remember thinking the first one was okay, and I know that the second one is historically recognised as very poor, and I'm really looking forward to that, as you can imagine. But this really didn't do it for me. I missed J. Jonah Jameson. There's no mention of him or the Daily Bugle or any of that backup team of the original films, and it's very hard for the actors to make their mark when it's been done well already, and this is an inferior version, an inferior Mark II. So, back in cinemas this weekend, if you're minded to go and see it, if you want to go and see it, I wouldn't bother myself. And I'll probably never watch this film again because it didn't really do much for me. However, I will watch the Raimi films again, probably in a couple of years' time, because I did enjoy them that much. Amazing Spider-Man, very disappointing, especially on a rewatch, and I'm going to give it 5 out of 10, and that's a fairly generous 5 out of 10. Coming up next week, then, we've got The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I'm really not looking forward to this. But in the interest of fairness, I will give it a go and I'll report back on that next weekend. If you've watched The Amazing Spider-Man, what do you think? Did it work for you more than it worked for me? As I said, my problem is I really, on the second rewatch recently, really love those films so much, and I get the way they all work. This just seems so inferior. Do you feel the same, or do you think this is better? Do you think this is more representative of Spider-Man? Let me know in the comments down below what you think of The Amazing Spider-Man, what you think of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. If you're planning to see this film this weekend, because I'm hoping this will be up before it's out of the cinema, because, as I say, these films are getting very limited weekend engagements. So yeah, let me know what you think of this version of The Amazing Spider-Man. I will see you soon. Plenty more to come on this channel. Stick around, please do, especially those new subscribers. If you stumbled across this, please like and subscribe. Join the journey of my world of stuff. Lots of stuff to come. I've got a new 6-part series coming up, which I'm looking forward to doing, which I won't say any more about at the moment, but it's based on TV shows from the past. I will talk more about that soon. I'll see you next time. Stick around, like and subscribe. Keep checking the stuff.